Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1987 film, The Living Daylights. Now, before I get around to sharing more of my thoughts on this film, I want to give a special shout out to Carl for requesting this review and for my thoughts on some Bond films. And if there's another film, TV show, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to my PayPal. The link will be in the video description down below, and I'll try to get to it as soon as I possibly can. Now, Living Daylights is the 15th film in the James Bond franchise, and it represents a transition period for the series because this was the first Bond film not to star Roger Moore, who had been Bond throughout most of the 70s and 80s. Now, The Living Daylights also represents my first exposure to the Bond franchise. It's actually the first James Bond film I ever remember watching. I saw it on VHS and remember really enjoying it, and that got me interested in the rest of the Bond films. And thanks to my parents, who bought the box sets of all the Bond films on DVD from Costco, when I was a kid, I was able to really get into the Bond franchise, dive deep into it at a young age. So the Bond films are definitely nostalgic for me, and this is one of the most nostalgic because it's my first. The sequence with the Aston Martin, with the rocket launcher, and the jet engine, that is a sequence that's just forever embedded in my memory. And this is honestly definitely in my top 10 when it comes to my favorite Bond films, not just because of the fact that I'm nostalgic for it, but because it's a damn good Bond movie. It was a really solid reinvention of the Bond character that was a lot closer to the source material, and it was a refreshing take on Bond, because prior to The Living Daylights, Bond was a campy franchise. It was an over-the-top cartoon. And there's a certain amount of fun to be had with that, but I prefer Bond to be a little more serious, a little bit more edgy, a little grittier, closer to the source material, at least nowadays. Like when I was a kid, the campy over-the-top Bond, and Spy Who Loved Me or Moonraker, that's the kind of stuff that, okay, that's fine. That's fine. That's entertaining, and it's still entertaining. But as an adult, I just prefer a darker take. I prefer a more realistic take on Bond. And The Living Daylights was the first glimpse of that. And in a lot of ways, The Living Daylights is ahead of its time because what you would see become very prevalent, very popular with the Bond franchise of the Daniel Craig films, which got a lot of acclaim, starting with Casino Royale, was actually something that was delved into with this film in 1987. Now, the film is directed by John Glen, who, prior to The Living Daylights, he directed a ton of other Bond films. He's most well known for his work in the Bond franchise, and this film is no exception. I think he did a great job. This is him using all the tools of his trade, all of the skills that he's learned throughout all the years and throughout all of these other Bond films, and putting them to use, and it leads to this film really having an epic look and feel to it. It feels like it's the Bond epic of the 80s because of the size and scope of it, because of all the different locations, with Gibraltar in the beginning during the training sequence, to the scenes in Czechoslovakia, and then you go from Czechoslovakia to Moscow, and then from Moscow to Tangier, and then you have these sweeping vistas in the desert, and It's a really genuinely epic looking film. It has some of my favorite action sequences in any of the Bond films. The sequence which takes place on this ice lake with the Aston Martin. Love that shot. Love that sequence. It's honestly one of the best. I love the way it's shot. I love the way that it's put together. It's always thrilling and exciting and fun to watch every time I see it. And even other stuff like the stuff with the plane at the end. I thought that was also well shot and well put together. And Glenn isn't really the type of guy who's gonna wow you with showy transitions or angles or POVs or some of the other stuff that other directors might do. He's a steady, capable filmmaker who doesn't like to really do a lot of flashy stuff unless it's a stunt. So he's the guy who you get to really make the action sequences pop, to make the action sequences all the more thrilling, all the more exciting, all the more fun, because he's able to really emphasize the best elements of the stunt sequences and of the action scenes. And that's really where John Glen shines. And The Living Daylights is no exception to that. The screenplay is by Richard Maybum and Michael G. Wilson, and it's loosely based on a short story by Ian Fleming called The Living Daylights. But other than a few things like the double agent, or I don't think she's actually a double agent, but the cello player who's working for the Russians, or unbeknownst to her, is working for the Russians, and Kara, she is one of the few things that is carried over from that short story, as well as the training mission gone wrong, which opens up the film. But everything else is just completely original and created solely for the film. This is also the last film in the Bond franchise that uses a title that was featured in an Ian Fleming novel or short story. All of the other Bond films afterwards were all original Bond titles that had never been used before in anything other than Casino Royale. But yeah, the script, I think it's a good script. I think the first half is stronger than the second. The stuff involving the opening in Gibraltar, which I think is a really good way to open up the film. It creates a lot of tension, and I really like how they introduce the new Bond, played by Timothy Dalton, in this kind of scenario. And, you know, the stuff in Czechoslovakia with the pipeline, and then in Moscow, and then Tangier. But once you get to the desert, that's where things, and Bond starts working with what might as well be the Taliban, like it's a prelude to Rambo 3. That's when the script kind of starts to lose a little bit of its luster for me. That's when it starts to not be as engaging. It's not like it's boring or anything. It's just not as consistently engaging and thrilling and as fun as the first half. I also don't feel that the script really does the best job in terms of making these villains feel like they are equals to Bond, or they are really much of a match for Bond. The script doesn't really give them a lot to really make them feel like they're that intimidating of a presence, or that memorable, or that strong. So it's kind of a letdown in that regard as well. And there are some twists and turns in some places that I think are efficient, but then there's other moments of the script where they do a twist here and there, and it's kind of misguided, or it just doesn't click as well as it could. But I still think it's a good script, because I think You have a great opening sequence in Gibraltar, and then you go from there to Czechoslovakia, have this cool idea with the Trans-Siberian pipeline being used to smuggle Koskov across the border to the west. And then you have the stuff in Moscow, and you have the sequence in Bratislava that leads to Austria and Vienna, and there's a really rousing, exciting, thrilling sequence on an ice lake with the newly improved Aston Martin, which, to be honest, that car is so sick, and it is so sickening to see that thing get blown up so quickly. But it was still awesome. It was still a really cool scene. It's everything that you want out of a Bond film and then some, with the Aston Martin, with the new improvements, the new additions, with the rocket jet engine, the missile launchers, the skis on the bottom so it can actually drive on ice. And then from that scene, it even goes from one thrilling sequence to the next, because you have that scene with Aston Martin, and then it transitions into the cello scene where Bond and Kara are on the cello case and they're sliding down the mountain, which reminded me of Willow, which I love that scene in Willow where they're on the sled and they're going down the mountain, Mad Mardigan and Willow. So anytime you remind me of that, you're definitely doing a good thing. And then you get this epic finale on this airbase and on an airplane, and some just incredible stunt work, where stuntmen are hanging outside a plane in the middle of the air, like tens of thousands of feet in the air, and they're hanging on the back of this bag, and the bag is going up and down, and it's dangerous, and the stuntman's head is like this close to like hitting the top of the plane and potentially killing them. It's some crazy shit. And yeah, there's a lot of just satisfying stuff about it. I even like the sequence where Bond corners the arms dealer guy, the American arms dealer, Brad Whitaker, who's got body armor, and he's got like this gun that has like a shield in front of it, and Bond outsmarts him and winds up killing him in a very crowd pleasing way. I don't feel the comeuppance that Koskov got was really that satisfying, though. That's one of the things that really wasn't the best, because he just gets arrested. Yeah, he just gets arrested in the diplomatic bag, which probably means he's gonna die. They're gonna kill him and then just put him in a body bag. But there was a sequence earlier where his Jeep got hit by I believe it got ran over by a plane and it exploded, but then he somehow survived. And I feel that just honestly should have been his demise. He just gets blown up by the plane. That would just be way more satisfying than what they did later on with Koskov. But still a good finale. I mean, even have a great sequence with a bridge getting blown up, and a sequence that was shot entirely with a miniature by John Richardson and his team. And it's still some of the most impressive miniature work you will ever see in anything. Even some of the stuff with the plane, the cargo plane, was done with miniatures. And you really can't tell. This is a great example of how even today you could go back to doing model work or miniatures, and if you shoot them the right way, it'd be hard to tell that it's not the real thing, and you're not just blowing up an actual full-size bridge. But yeah, this script, it's got a lot of good things, a lot of good elements. I even like the dynamic between Bond and Kara, and I think that it definitely does get what makes a good Bond film tick. You got a good opening. You got a good hook in terms of why Bond is sent on another mission and what the mission is. You've got Bond gadgets that you look for and expect in a Bond movie with the souped up Aston Martin and some of the other stuff, which I thought was cool, like this keychain that if Bond whistles a part of the British anthem, uh, I think it's O Britannia, it'll actually emit a gas that would just knock somebody out. And it can also be a bomb too. So I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, the script, it's good. It's a good script. You even have Felix Leiter who makes a little appearance and helps Bond. Now, speaking of Bond, though, this film was also known for being the debut of Timothy Dalton as James Bond. And I love Dalton's Bond. I've always loved Dalton's Bond ever since I was a kid. And it's kind of a toss-up between his Bond and like Daniel Craig for me for my favorite Bond. Because I really love his take on the character. You could tell that he had a lot of passion for this performance and this role because he was a big fan of the Ian Fleming novels and he wanted to bring Bond back to his roots. He wanted to kind of do what Michael Keaton did for Batman in Batman 89, where he brought Batman back into a more serious perspective for others and for the audience. He made Batman a character that wasn't all camp, a character that had a little bit more seriousness to him or a little bit more edge. And that's what Dalton did with Bond, with The Living Daylights. He brought Bond back to his roots and made Bond still as suave as ever, but also deadlier, also more dangerous. And the advertising for The Living Daylights even took a spin on that because they would have like Bond is dangerous, Dalton is dangerous, and he is. Dalton's a dangerous Bond, and he takes risks, but he also shows emotion, and he shows a lot of humanity, and there's a certain depth to his Bond that you didn't really necessarily get with Roger Moore or any of the other performers. And when it comes to the action, he's as believable as any of the other actors. In fact, he did a lot of his own stunts. He was actually the one that was hanging off the top of the Jeep during the opening sequence. That was him. And he actually did the stunt where he got on top of the Jeep and then swung his way back into the Jeep from on top of it while it's driving around and it's near the edge of a cliff. Like, he did all of that himself. And during the shoot, I think it was the director or one of the producers, when they saw that Dalton was doing that, they were like, no, Dalton, what are you doing? Timothy, no. And Dalton was like, he could not care less. He was like, I'm doing it. I'm dangerous. So he did his own stunt there, and he did a few other stunts, and I feel Dalton was just great. I thought he was terrific in the role. I know Siskel and Ebert gave the film 2 thumbs down for some reason when it came out, and heavily criticized Dalton and said that he lacked humor. I thought there was enough humor here. It just wasn't as tongue-in-cheek and campy as what Roger Moore brought to the role. And I think that's a good thing. And Dalton, it's really interesting how he became Bond, because Albert Broccoli, he wanted Dalton all the way back to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And Dalton even did a screen test, and apparently it went well, but Dalton decided to turn the role down because he felt he was too old for the role. And so they went with George Lazenby. And even in 1971 for Diamonds Are Forever, Albert wanted Dalton. but Dalton had scheduling conflicts and couldn't do it, couldn't commit. So they paid Sean Connery a record amount of money to come back and do Diamonds Are Forever. And then after Diamonds Are Forever, Roger Moore took over. But even in 1981, with For Your Eyes Only, Broccoli wanted Dalton, but Dalton couldn't do it yet again. Had issues with his schedule. Then, in A View to a Kill, he tried to get Dalton to play Bond. But once again, Dalton had problems. Could not shoot. Could not fit the film into his shooting schedule. And that's unfortunate because A View to a Kill, it's got other issues like Tanya Roberts, for instance, and her dead weight. Oh, I broke a nail performance as the Bond girl. But one of them was definitely Roger Moore, who was showing his age and was not believable in the role anymore. And if you had Dalton in that film, I think that film would have been so much better. And can you imagine Timothy Dalton's Bond versus Christopher Walken's Zorin? That would have been epic. But no, we didn't get that. And we almost didn't even get this. We almost didn't even get The Living Daylights because, once again, Albert's chosen man that he wanted to play Bond for years had a scheduling conflict. He was shooting the film Brenda Starr, and he couldn't do it. So they had to search for someone else. They did a big casting search. They did a lot of different screen tests. One of them was actually Sam Neill, who you might remember as Dr. Alan Grant in Jurassic Park. And a lot of the other people involved with the production, they liked Sam, but Albert didn't. So they nixed that idea. And then they brought in Pierce Brosnan, and the screen test went well. And Pierce was actually cast and ready to roll as Bond for The Living Daylights. But scheduling conflicts. Fate would have it that Pierce, because of the fact that he was only able to do a screen test and potentially do this film because of the fact that Remington Steele, the show that he was on, was in a bit of a hiatus at the time and was in limbo, where the producers was kind of waiting to see whether or not the network was going to ask for more episodes. And the network ultimately decided to do another season. So now Pierce wasn't as fully available. But NBC, they agreed they were willing to work around the schedule so they could market Pierce as the new Bond back as Remington Steele. But Albert Broccoli infamously said, Pierce Brosnan will never be Bond. Remington Steele will never be James Bond. And that then left the door open for another actor to play the role. And there's a rumor that Albert actually offered Christopher Reeve $1 million to play Bond. And he would have been the first American actor to play Bond. But Chris turned it down. And I knowing the type of guy that Chris is, I saw that coming. Like, he probably would have asked Christopher and said, hey, here's $1 million to play Bond. And Chris would have politely turned it down and would be like, no, Bond is a British man. I'm an American. Can't do it. I appreciate the offer, but, I'm not right for the role. And Brenda Starr finally finished shooting because of all these delays. And so that opened the door up for Dalton to finally play the character. And I think it was a really nice bit of fate because Dalton was tremendous. He was fantastic in the role. He did a great job, made it his own instantly, added a lot of weight to the role, and definitely took it seriously because he's a committed actor. He's a stage actor. He's not only just an actor of the screen, he's also a very well-renowned stage actor. And he brought a lot of that to the character. and it was very refreshing. And I just love his take on Bond. And a lot of the things that people love about Daniel Craig's Bond, Dalton did first, and didn't get enough credit. And it's really nice to see that after all these years, Dalton is becoming more appreciated by fans and by people who are just getting into the franchise, because he absolutely deserves it, and then some. Maryam D'Abo, she's fine too. I'm not going to say her performance is amazing, but for what it is, it works. I think she has some good rapport with Timothy Dalton. Joe Don Baker, I really like as Brad Whitaker. I just wish there was more for that character to do and make him a little bit more memorable. As it is, like, his character, the most memorable thing about his character is the decor in his lair, where he's got all these different historical figures that are dressed up as him. So it's like him dressed up as these historical figures, like Hitler and Caesar and all these other people, like Attila the Hun and so on. And his obsession with war and with Civil War memorabilia and some of this all this other stuff. Like, a lot of the aesthetic stuff is more memorable than his actual performance. You've got Art Malik, who plays this guy named Kamran, a leader in the Mujahideen. Didn't really do much for me. That performance is just kind of there. John Rhys-Davies, Salah, he's in this as Pushkin, this new head of the KGB. He was good. It was fun to see him in a Bond film. Andreas Wisniewski, he plays Nekros, the main henchman of Koskov, who's the one that Bond fights on the plane and kicks him off the plane. He's the guy who Bond gave him the boot. And you also have, of course, Jeroen Krabbé, who plays Koskov, who's essentially the main villain in this. And Jeroen Krabbé is good, but he's not given a lot to do. There's not a lot for his character to do in terms of this, for the character to really provide a lot to the audience, to really make his character sink in and become memorable, a memorable Bond villain, an iconic Bond villain. Say whatever you want about Christopher Walken's over-the-top acting in View to a Kill as Zorin, he's still a memorable villain. I can't say the same about Jeroen Krabbé as Koskov or Joe Don Baker as Whitaker. And of course, you got long-running members of the franchise like Desmond Llewellyn, who's back as Q, and this time around he's got a boombox. It's a boombox that is literally a boombox because it has a rocket launcher in it. And you have a new actress, though, who plays Miss Moneypenny this time around. It's not the same one. So you have a new actress, Caroline Bliss, who plays Miss Moneypenny. And there was, of course, there's Felix Leiter, played by John Terry this time around. And then there's Nadim Swalhala, who cameos as a police chief. He was actually in The Spy Who Loved Me as a character named Aziz. But, that's the cast. Definitely, and of course you have Robert Brown, who plays M. But the main performers are Dalton, D'Abo, Krabbé, and Wisniewski, with a little bit of John Rhys-Davies and Joe Don Baker. But Dalton is definitely the one that is the biggest standout among all of them. The film also features some cinematography by Alec Mills, which is not what I would consider amazing or awesome or awe-inspiring, but it works for the film, works for what they're trying to do. The editing by John Grover and Peter Davies I thought was actually pretty exemplary. I thought it was a really well-edited film for the most part. The The action sequences are definitely where the editing shines the most, but that's how it is in a lot of Bond films. But another place where it shines is definitely the opening credits, which I just love the Bond credit sequences. They're so much fun to watch. They're so creative, and they're usually really well edited. And so yeah, it's a well edited film when it comes to the action sequences and some of the other moments in the film. And you also have a good score by John Barry. This is I honestly feel this is arguably his best work. He's at the top of his game here. His rendition of the Bond theme in this film to me is the best version of the Bond theme. There are other versions out there, but this version to me is the most epic, is the most badass, is the most exciting and just rousing to listen to. And the way that he incorporates beats from the Aha song, The Living Daylights, into the actual soundtrack is some of the best inclusion of a soundtrack mix that I've ever heard in anything. And yeah, it's a really good score. And the film has a good soundtrack too. I think Aha's The Living Daylights is one of the best Bond songs. It's definitely one of the catchier tunes. And even the songs by the Pretenders are also good, that are a part of the soundtrack. And the film is only 130 minutes, but it doesn't drag too much. Like, it drags a little bit in the second half, but then it quickly picks up steam after that. So it doesn't really get to the point where it's too boring. And you also have like a budget of 40 million that is absolutely 100% on the screen. I think this was like the most expensive Bond film at the time. And you can definitely see that with the vast different amount of sets, the sweeping scope of the film in terms of all the different places that they shot, as well as like the more complicated, more epic stunt work and all of that. Like, just a really grand spectacle of a Bond film. But anyway, I don't really have much else to say about The Living Daylights except thanks for watching my review. And as always, I'll see you later.